Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is S.M. Traphagen. S.M., or Shannon, is the author of Finding Morgan, the first novel in the LeFay Trilogy series. Finding Morgan is fantasy mixed with adventure, romance, and mythology, and the ultimate fight between light and darkness. Shannon, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much, Howard.
All right. And, I have to admit to you, when we had sent out our messages and inquiring about different authors, and you responded and you shared the link to Finding Morgan Le Fay, I actually knew who that was.
You did.
I mean, I knew the name. Okay, this is a part of the story of King Arthur. Now, I do have to admit as well, I didn't know anything else. I didn't, because I hadn't been involved with the reading or some of the movies on King Arthur. So I think it's perfect timing, the new year, and let's give our listeners a new understanding of you, your work, and who is Morgan Le Fay. So let's start with you. How'd you get into this writing of these fiction, fantasy, adventure, romance novels?
It's quite interesting. I've always wanted to be a writer, and I've always been a storyteller in some format. When I was a kid, I had a bad habit telling very lengthy stories, a lot of times, to get out of trouble. But I found really interesting ways. Yeah, I'm the one. I found a way of navigating my way out of situations. And I always had this fascination with mythology and fiction and folklore. I was always very taken with the tale of King Arthur. And in my adult life, even though my path originally started out in another direction, I was always writing and crafting and developing stories on the side. And it was actually after watching, there was a television series that was on in the early 2000s, I believe, called Merlin. And it was very well known. I think they got about 4 seasons out of it. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Katie McGrath who played the part of Morgan Le Fay.
Okay.
And through watching that show, as there were many other spinoffs of the Tales of King Arthur, I kept coming back to this question of, why does she continue to get a bad rap? And so I started doing some digging and some research, and had found a poem by Gregory Melmoth that he wrote about Morgan Le Fay, one of the few that was written about her. I found tons of books about the character of Morgan Le Fay as the sorceress. But I started to wonder, wouldn't it be neat to really tell a story of a young woman in today's day and age who has a broken family life and is really struggling with some mental health issues and anxiety, and trying to find a way to get by and figure out who she is, thinks her mother is mentally ill, and then comes to find out through a series of tragedies and traumas that take place that maybe she really could be the descendant of this long-lost sorceress, and what would that look like? And that was really how the story started to get crafted and how I started to really develop it. It was this obsession of kind of giving her a reprieve, because I felt bad for her in a way, and just felt she got a really bad rap through all the folklore and the mythology. And that's really how it started.
All right. And as any good podcaster does in preparation for interviewing his or her guest, we do some research. And I went out to Google, so did my Google search for Morgan Le Fay. And then, as any good scholar understands, you can't totally rely on Wikipedia, but it's a good place to start to then go off on other paths. And one thing I saw when I was doing my search of Morgan Le Fay and then Google, then Wikipedia, there was a lot of descriptions of her and depictions of her which came from different angles. And so was she good? Was she bad? Was she an antagonist? Was she just a casual observer? And in the paintings themselves, I mean, it was really kind of hard to say, like, who was she? And I think just in that context in itself, I mean, it would be easy to misunderstand who this person was unless we really knew her. And I guess going back into the Arthurian, is that how you pronounce it? Legends?
Yes, Arthurian.
I did.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. It's good. This is good for afternoon.
Yeah, you're good.
All right. Is how much of reality was, King Arthur, and then how much reality was, I don't want to say antagonists, but the people he associated himself with during early years in what was, I guess, known as Britannia. Hope I got that one right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As you did your research on her, what were you discovering, and how did you decide, okay, this is going to be in the context of what I want to write? No, I don't like or believe this thread of evidence, so to speak. How did you make those decisions of what you kept and what you left out, or what worked, what didn't work for your story?
It's interesting, it's kind of the penultimate question, isn't it? Was King Arthur a real individual? And through tons of research and scouring a ton of materials, there is this real question of the fact that at some point in time, probably during the time of the Druids and Attila the Hun, I mean, you're going back a very long time, there was a man who was deemed the king for those regions, and primarily for the reason that the Druids were really taking a lot of territory, and he had a lot of strength and a lot of command. So the chances of him being a real individual that later stories were told about is probably close to some sort of truth. I mean, that's really where all folklore and fiction or mythology comes from, are these small threads of truth. It's interesting as you go through a lot of the research, there's actually, King Arthur is also part of this whole sword in the stone type of storytelling. He pulled the sword from the stone and he was deemed to have the greatest strength, and so became king and defeated his enemies. Well, Britain and Ireland have that story, have that right. But in Italy, there's an actual sword in a stone, and it has been dated to the time of when King Arthur would have been around. So there's some fact to that, and it's still there. It's encased in glass right now in a church in a small village in Italy. But Italy is claiming that that's where the sword was originally heaved into. There's some discrepancy as to, where it all took place. But as you dig into and dive into some of these tidbits, what I found most fascinating and what I really wanted to tell and get across was Morgan Le Fay, the sorceress, was a half sister to King Arthur. She was a half daughter. She was the daughter of King Uther, who was Arthur's father. He had an affair. Morgan was born. Her mother had been a sorceress. Her mother had been kind of driven out, cast aside, because at the time Uther didn't want magic in and around his realm. Arthur felt bad for her, kind of brought her into the fold, but she always felt like she was kind of cast aside. She was allowed to be in court and whatnot, but she also had powers. And so she always felt like she had to hide a part of who she was. And eventually that resentment built up. And then Arthur took hold of the crown. And so there's this sense of part of her, because as the story continues to unfold, she eventually saves his life in the end. She takes him to Tintagel Castle during this big battle, and he disappears from existence in the stories. And as the story goes, they say that she saved his life. He remained at the castle with her in her Tintagel Castle and kind of lived out the remainder of his days and passed away. There was this constant pull of, I'm good, but I'm also resentful and I'm angry and I've been kind of cast aside and I was never truly loved. And so that's where I really wanted to kind of dive into what would that look like? And if you take it into present day and you've got this young girl who doesn't know who she is and struggles with a very torn and fractured relationship with her mother, who really truly does believe that they are the descendants of this sorceress, and some traumas that take place early on, which I don't want to reveal to those who haven't read it yet, it definitely pushes her to this limit of wanting to get away from her mother and reinvent herself and have a safe haven. But through the course of doing that, she starts to realize that she doesn't really know who she is and she needs to figure that out. And that's a very fine line for her to walk. And so, yeah, there was a lot of picking at threads, but I wanted to tie it to some real themes that people struggle with in real life. And I think that's what makes it such a fun novel.
Yeah, and speaking of the real themes that people are struggling with, I really appreciated the article from Buffalo News about their acknowledging your background as a social worker, a mental health professional, working in a field which, from a trauma perspective, that's a very intense field. And then crafting this book. And I like the way they described it. And I'm curious how your background as a social worker, mental health professional, how did that inform how you began to evolve the story of this character, Morgan Le Fay, in the book?
When you see a lot of what mental health is such a big topic right now all across the world, whether it's, regarding our fractured political systems, or if it's discussing trauma and abuse, or people who are trying to get over addictions, or people who are suffering from family members who've been diagnosed with disease. I mean, there's just so many different forms of battles and struggles with mental health issues. And when you take a look at people like Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, who tragically recently lost their lives to a battle of depression and anxiety and mental health issues, those have been themes that have been prevalent for just so long. And a lot of what I saw and dealt with were real issues of not dealing with anxiety and being afraid of facing whatever fear they were struggling with, whether it was some type of traumatic event or a broken household. A lot of the people that I was working with at the time were mostly teenagers and very fractured family lives, and trying to figure out how to navigate that. And coming from an experience of having dealt with my own personal anxiety, tends to get passed down through the family lines, I know what that feels like, to have to try to figure out and navigate a way of knowing what fear is real fear and what fear is just this constant worry and dread that doesn't really even exist. And how do you figure that out? It's such an important theme because not enough people even know how to really describe how they feel, let alone want to make it public or talk about it. And for me, the most important thing was, how do I write a very, very fictional book that's very mythical and very magical in a sense, but also ties in these real themes that people can sit there and say, wow, I really relate to that, or that's exactly how I feel, and then find some inspiration and positivity through this character. And that was what I really wanted to get across to people. So, I pulled a lot from past experience and what I knew people struggled with, but I wanted to keep it to specific themes. There's a lot of, you could dive into a ton of different mental health issues, but anxiety and panic are so prevalent in the sense of they tend to lead to other issues for people if they're not properly dealt with. And for some people, they're just scared to even talk about them because they don't know exactly how to even frame them for people, because they're still, you think of anxiety and people are like, what does that really mean? And so that's kind of what I was hoping to drive home with us.
It's interesting. This morning's podcast was with a children's book author. Lisa Rose wrote a number of books dealing with how do we in the community, whether we are disadvantaged through economics and race and religion, are we somehow disadvantaged? No, I wouldn't say disadvantaged, but maybe we have a disability. In this case, the disability was blindness. And how do we as a community learn to not shy away or be afraid of having conversations or engaging with individuals who, at least on the onset, are leery about engaging with them, not because they dislike them or are afraid, but maybe maybe it is afraid, a little scared of, I may say or do the wrong thing, therefore it's safest not to do anything at all, which in a sense exacerbates the problem. So in the mental health arena, whether we have anxiety or panic and some worry and dread, the worst thing we can do is just say, well, we just leave them alone, not do anything. We should be engaging. And I love the fact that you're able then to take your experience, your understanding of the conversations and the voice and bring that into your characters. And also, congratulations on the reviews. There's the readers' favorites, which I'm coming to appreciate because a number of my guests on the podcast have had some really wonderful reviews. And the one said, fast-paced, intelligently plotted, expertly developed. And another one acknowledged as a standout in fiction and fantasy. And I'm curious what your other readers are saying, because your book's been out for just a little while. And there's also two more, coming. So, yeah. So
from which I'm getting a lot of pressure about.
Well, something, if you can do better than George R.R. Martin, you're okay.
Got it. I hope so.
Okay.
That was a long wait.
Yeah. My lifetime, I don't think the next book's going to ever be written.
I know. My dad says the same thing. There's always hope, though, right?
We always have to have hope. Yes. What are your readers saying? I mean, our friends and our family, our colleagues want nothing but the best for us. But what's kind of like this aha when, I've written, this is so cool. Somebody has acknowledged my book, or they've read it. They've met me, and I've never met them before. What are people like that saying to you about your work?
So it's interesting. The review process is usually a slow trickle, and then it tends to snowball, especially when you're still a fairly unknown author without massive name recognition, like Oprah, for example. And I keep waiting for, and not to say that I want somebody to go ahead and do this, but the reviews have been outstanding, both on Goodreads and on Amazon, even in Barnes & Noble. People have gone in and written reviews about how much they've really attached to certain characters and how some characters have driven them nuts, or they didn't really like the husband, Morgan's husband. It's been really interesting to see and read some of what people have thought. One woman, she said that she compared my books to some of Nora Roberts' books, and I thought that was very surprising. I've read a few of Nora Roberts' books, and I think they're very romantically driven, if I'm not mistaken. But it was through a book read that I recently did for a book club. And I was taken aback, actually, by how large this book club was. There were probably a good 15 to 20 women in this book club that were there, that all came. And I got peppered for about 2 hours with a lot of very, very well-written and very intelligent questions. And one woman who had read the book sat there and said, when I was reading when Morgan was going through a couple of her anxiety bouts, I sat there and said, wow, the author must know how this feels, because this is exactly how I feel. And that was kind of an aha moment for me, because she really seemed to attach to that real feeling, that real experience. And she's like, I could picture it. I knew exactly how it felt. My palms even got a little sweaty as I was reading it. And that was when I was like, okay, this is what I want. I want people to be entertained, but I also want them to be like, wow, I really know what this feels like. And then find inspiration and light through how she battles against whatever it is she's going through. And then the other aha moment was another reader who said that the book reminded her of A Wrinkle in Time, which I found, it blew me away. It is a children's book for all intents and purposes. It's a book that is very well regarded among many adults, kind of like a Harry Potter thing. Many adults read it. Oprah Winfrey, Reese Witherspoon just remade a movie about A Wrinkle in Time. And it was actually the book, when I was in undergrad, I was studying literature. It was one of the books I had to write a report about, and we had to read as part of the process. And it became the book that really sparked my interest in becoming a fiction author. To this day, I don't know how many times I have read that book. I have read it a gazillion times. I mean, it is just, I absolutely love that book. So that was hugely rewarding to hear somebody compare my book to A Wrinkle in Time, which was really kind of what got me going in the writing field. So yeah, so that's kind of those were kind of my moments. And it's been great. I mean, the response to date has been really amazing. And I've just been really excited by what people think. And, and if people don't like it, that's okay too. I don't mind. I mean, everybody has their own opinions, but so far people seem to really, really enjoy it.
That's fantastic. And I have to share too, and since doing the podcast and when we have really, I don't know if it's been using some sailing metaphors, tacked or jibed or into the wind, and kind of focusing on authors, it's been pretty amazing, some of the bodies of work that have been out there. And I've had the pleasure of reading a number of the books besides binge watching The Mandalorian and Expanse on TV over the holidays. It's been great just to kind of catch up with some of the books that my guests have produced. And it just sounds like such a fascinating piece of work that even a guy like me could get into. And I guess the question is you mentioned a number of women, young girls at the book reading, the book club. Is your genre? Is it geared more towards?
It's really anybody.
Okay.
It really is geared towards anybody. It's not female or male driven. There's actually a male character in the book that becomes a really central, pivotal character for her inner circle. And so even though the main protagonist is Morgan, a couple of the side characters, a couple of her cohorts really take on some central themes. And one of them is a very male driven character, Irishman, who's living in the States. And his character really, I kind of flesh his character out quite a bit in book 2. And so for even men reading it, I mean, my husband has read it. And even though you would think it would be a very biased opinion because he's my husband and he loves me, he's very much an engineer. He's very much a car guy, head under the hood of a car. He works in military for work. He doesn't read books like this. He reads car magazines and, how-to DIY publications. So when he read this, he couldn't put it down. And he kept after every chapter was, I don't understand. Why would you do that? And what happens next? And what does he say? And he really got into it. And it was very genuine. And it took me back because I did not expect him to like it that much. So, and my father has read it too, and my whole family has read it, and they've been amazingly supportive. But my parents, my mom and my dad, are very avid readers, and it's where I get my love of reading from, and my love of literature. And they're both very voracious readers, and particularly my dad.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and so I was very nervous about both of them reading it because they don't hold back. If they don't like it or there's something that could be different, they will let you know. And my mom read it in 24 hours. Which really surprised me because it's not a very...
That's the equivalent of a binge watch.
It is. She said, she was texting me at 1:00 in the morning because she'd get to another part that shocked her. And I'd be like, I couldn't even read them. And I was completely floored the next day when she told me she had finished it in 24 hours. And my dad honestly had started to read it, put it down because a couple of the chapters he just felt like were just too slow for him in the beginning, but then he picked it back up again and read it. And he said it took months. And then he finally said, after I got through those 2 or 3 chapters that I just felt were just annoying me, they were, it was a lot of backstory for her. He's like, I finally got it. He's like, and then all of a sudden I couldn't put it down. He's like, and then I finished it. He goes, it was a great book.
Wow.
He goes, it was really, really well done. And that really was shocking to hear. And because he was very honest about why it took him a little bit longer, but that he loved it.
That's a nice story. So do your parents introduce you, or does your husband introduce you as my wife, the novelist, or my daughter, the novelist?
He does. He does have a tendency to say this, and it's like, oh, my wife's an author. People say, oh, what do you do? And he jumps right in. Oh, she's an author. She's written a book. You should go get it. So my husband is hugely proud and very, very supportive of this endeavor for me to continue doing this type of work and this type of writing. And as my parents and my brother and my sister, my brother talks about it constantly. He promotes the book down where he lives, and it's been great. It's been great to have that kind of support from the people that you love the most, especially when they enjoy the work. My sister even put up a picture of herself with her daughter as she was reading the book, and there's my little niece staring at the cover, sucking her thumb, and my sister's got her glasses on reading, and it was cute. So yeah, they've been great.
That's fantastic. Yeah, you should have pictures up on your Instagram or Facebook page of your readers with your book. I think that would be pretty cute. So I'm curious. Two items. One is a little bit more insight into books 2 or 3, because we did say this is the trilogy series, the LeFay Trilogy series. So let's do that question first, because I'll hold back on the second question. How is that coming along now that you've published the first book and you've got envisioned a second and third piece of the series?
So I'm probably about a third of the way through, maybe a quarter of the way through writing the second book. I'm almost halfway through writing it. I'm hoping to really have it out there this year. The second book it's to the point now where it's really fast paced, and it can kind of pick it up and read it if you wanted to without having read the first book and kind of get a sense of what's going on. But I wouldn't say completely that it's a standalone in and of itself. You probably want a little bit of background, but it really dives more into Morgan's journey to figure out who exactly she is and what is it she's going to need to do to protect herself and eventually her family. And as that continues to develop, one of the other characters from the first book, Roan, who's the Irishman.
Hey, by the way, Shannon, you gave a name away. Yes. I didn't do that. Okay. So.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. He's actually his name is on the back cover, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
In the
I
jack
just
of the
wanted
back.
to be clear about that. Okay, I didn't give anything away.
Yeah. Yes. No. I have no problem mentioning character names from the first book because they're all fascinating characters. Her husband Anthony and the archaeologist Jeffrey. There's just so many colorful characters that start to develop from the first book that I love writing about. But Roan is one of those characters where I have had many readers say he's enigmatic. There's something about him, and are you gonna tell us more about him? And they just want to know more. And his character does really get developed a bit more in book 2, and you start to learn a bit more about who he is and why he becomes who he becomes in the first book. That tends to get it's an interesting. The book 2 is kind of this interesting journey of him needing to take a journey, and so the readers really get to follow that journey a bit solo, and then follow Morgan's journey. So there's kind of this: they're all together, and there's this journey they take together, and then there's also these storylines that are written separately for each of them. So that really gets discussed quite a bit in book 2, and then book 3. There's it's this this battle of good and evil, which is something we face in everyday life and reality. We're seeing it play out in many news cycles right now. And so book 3, there's this ultimate battle that really starts to heat up at the end of book 2. And in book 3, that gets discovered and really gets fleshed out. I don't want to say too much more about book 3 because I know how it ends.
Fair enough.
And I've still got to focus on book 2, which is a process that's ongoing. I had to take a few months to step back due to some personal stuff going on with my family, but I am getting back into it soon.
Okay. Actually, a second question that's coming into my head, and I want to ask it, but I'm not because I don't want to put any pressure on you, but it has the word screenplay in it. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. But if you need to meet some screenplay writers, that's the other nice part about this podcast is I get to meet a lot of cool people. So just say the word and we'll make some introductions for you. What has been your lessons learned now that you have done the research, you've written the book, you're in the midst of book 2, and book 3 is down the ways a piece? What have you learned about yourself?
If you had asked me this question 5 or 6 months ago, I would have said my drive and my passion to be an author and to tell stories, and my tenacity for learning how to be a businesswoman. Because being an author, especially when you don't have much of a name and you've got an indie publisher who you're working with, you really have to learn a lot about the craft and about being your own marketing person and kind of being your own business. Even with a big 4, even with a traditional publisher, a lot of unknown authors have to do a lot of the footwork themselves, a lot of the marketing themselves. They really have to drive their own funnels for getting the book out there, which many people might not know. But over the last 5 or 6 months, and I don't have a problem disclosing this because I do want other people to learn from this. My husband in August was diagnosed with brain cancer, and we're very young, and we were in the midst of starting our family. And so there were some themes that from the book that were actually playing out a bit in my own personal life. And for me, what I've really learned is that just like as Morgan is starting to kind of find in her life in the book, I have this never give up attitude. And through my husband's journey over the last 5.5 months, I've learned that my superpower is putting my head down and just getting through the muck and just doing what needs to get done and staying extremely positive. My husband and I have both been extremely positive about this entire process, and we are very faithful individuals. And so it's been interesting because I juggled everything I needed to juggle. I continued doing whatever interviews I needed to do. I juggled work and taking care of my husband and getting him to treatments and doing what we needed to do. And thankfully, there is no evidence of cancer right now. It looks like the tumor is dead. He has really surprised the doctors in a lot of ways. And he is doing extraordinarily well. He is off all the medications and going back to work, working out, and for all intents and purposes, extremely healthy. And so we are extremely grateful. But that is probably one of my biggest lessons that I have learned through this process, and even going into the second book, because there are more things that Morgan will have to face. And having such a personal experience with dealing with a trauma like this, having to walk through and hold my head up and say, we're going to be okay, and we're going to get through this, and I'm not going to ask why, and we're just going to do it, and we got to do what we got to do. That can be very tough. And you really don't know what you're made of until something like this happens. And the people that you surround yourself, our family, our friends, the community has just rallied around us in a way that I never expected. And Morgan is starting to get that sense as well in the second book. And so writing it for me is becoming a bit of a different process than it did with the first book, because I relate to certain things that she's walking through much more personally than I did with the first book. And so it's changing the way I'm seeing her character going into the second book.
Wow. And thank you so much for sharing that. That was more than I could have hoped for. That type of gift to us about this part of your journey. So thank you so much for that. And Shannon, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work and just really to get to know you and this journey as an author, where's the best places for them to go?
Absolutely, my website. It's www.smtraphagen, so my initials SM, and then traphagen.com. For anybody who wants to know more about my day-to-day work, or when I'm doing interviews or appearances or speaking events, which I am taking on much more of in the way of motivational speaking, especially given what my husband and I are walking through, I want to help others. So people can go to my website. They can learn more about the book. I'm giving tidbits about the second book, and I do a monthly newsletter called Tuesday Twos. And so people can sign up for that. And I give little tidbits about Morgan's journey, kind of on the sidelines, what she might be currently doing and what she might be facing, and then events and things and fun stuff that go on. My Instagram is smtraphagen_write life, WRITE life. So I write about life, and even in my fiction, I tend to weave that in. So people can visit me there. They can visit me at smtraphagen on Facebook, and on Twitter, it's Fiction and Food. So it's Shannon at Fiction and Food.
We didn't even go down that one, the food aspect of it, but hey, that's another story.
I used to be a food writer, yeah. So that's kind of where that started off from. So yeah.
Oh my God, now there's total envy here, because my ideal career is food, travel, and photography. And I can now add podcasting in it, because as a podcaster, as long as I've got an internet connection, I can do it anywhere in the world. I can do all three now, all four of those now.
There you go. You just made your own plug.
All right. Well, listen, Shannon, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us on the Success Insight podcast and share with us this woman who is deeply involved in your life, Morgan LeFay, and this first novel of yours, Finding Morgan. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
All right, folks, we have just been listening to our podcast with SM Traphagen. Shannon is the author of Finding Morgan, the first novel in the LeFay Trilogy series, and we will most definitely provide links on our show notes back to her website, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram accounts, and we'll also have backlinks to the book on Amazon. We don't just kind of niche down into one particular area and just keep going deeper and deeper. We tend to cover a lot of topics, and sometimes you just have to go where the wind is taking you. But we learned a lot about Shannon. We learned a lot about Morgan and this journey they are both going on together. So I hope you enjoyed it. Do let us know in the comments or likes on our notes on our webpage, successinsightpodcast.com. If you find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, soon to be Pinterest. I can't believe I signed up for Pinterest today. That's a whole other story. But do let us know what you think about today's podcast or our podcast in general. But above all, our goal is to make these stories as informative to you as possible and to give you some opportunities to read some really fantastic literature. So go out, have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.